The man who volunteered was not a heckler. That is the part that gets lost every time this story is told, and it is the part that makes it worth telling. He was one of the finest tournament fighters in the country. He was funny, the crowd adored him, and he had a legitimate technical objection to what he had just watched. He was also about to make a single small mistake, not with his mouth, with his body, and it would be the most instructive mistake of his life. The hall was one of those cavernous municipal buildings, American cities built in the 1950s, for boat shows and rented out on weekends. 3,000 people in the bleachers, banners hung from the girders, a competition floor marked out in tape, and along the far side, standing in rows in white guy with their hands behind their backs, maybe 80 black belts from a dozen schools. The air smelled like canvas and liniment, and hot dogs from the concession at the back. Everyone who mattered in American karate was in that room. The demonstrations ran between the divisions: board breaking, tile breaking, a form with a staff that got a good hand. And then, near the middle of the afternoon, the announcer read a name most of the crowd knew from magazines, and a compact man in a black mandarin-collared uniform walked onto the floor with no entourage and no fanfare, under a banner that read, in letters 2 feet high, 1-inch punch demonstration. If you want to understand why a room full of experts was about to be wrong in public, stay with this, because the objection that got raised that afternoon was a good one, and it was raised by the best man in the building to raise it. He explained it before he did it, which is a thing showmen never do, and teachers always do. He said the punch was not a trick and not a secret, that anyone in the room could learn it, and that it would take about 3 years. Most people generate power by traveling, winding up, stepping in, giving the fist a runway. But the distance is not what makes the power, the distance is what makes the power visible. Organize the body correctly, and the runway can be 1 inch, because the power does not come from the arm at all. It comes from the ground, up through the legs and hips and spine, and the fist is simply the last thing it passes through on its way out. The 80 black belts along the wall listened to this the way professionals listen to another professional, carefully and skeptically, and with their arms folded. He called for a volunteer, and the man who raised his hand was standing in the second row of those white gelid, and when he stepped out onto the floor, the crowd made a noise because they knew him. He was tall and lean and built like a decathlete, with a magnificent afro and a moustache and a black belt earned in the hardest divisions in the sport. He was a southern boy who had grown up being told what he could not do and had made a career out of doing it anyway. He had a smile that could take a room, and he took this one, walking out with a swagger that was half genuine and half performance, and 3,000 people loved him for it. And he was not there to be a good sport. He had a point to make. He turned to the crowd, then to the 80 men along the wall, and said, loud and cheerful, that he wanted to say something respectfully. He had been hit by some of the hardest men in this sport. He had been hit by heavyweights with a full step behind them, and tapping his own chest twice with 2 fingers, right on the sternum, the gesture the crowd would talk about for years. He said that if a man could not step and could not wind up and could not travel, he did not much care how that man organized his hips. He said, go on, use your best. The crowd howled. The black belts along the wall grinned into their collars, because he had said out loud the thing that every one of them was thinking. And the small man in black did not take offense at any of it. He nodded, as though a fair question had been asked at a lecture, and he said the only thing he said in that entire exchange. He said, relax. The champion laughed. Of course he did. And then he did the exact opposite, because he was a fighter, and because 3,000 people were watching, and because every instinct built into 20 years of contact sport tells a man that when a fist is coming toward his chest, he should set his feet and lock his core and become a wall. He widened his stance, he rolled his shoulders forward, he locked down through the midsection until the front of his gi went taut, and he braced. That was the mistake. Here is the part worth staying for, because almost nobody in that hall understood it until afterward, and some of them not for years. A relaxed body is a bad conductor. Hit a relaxed man, and he moves, he gives, he rolls, he spreads the energy across his frame and loses most of it. That is why boxers are taught to stay loose. A braced body is a rigid structure, and a rigid structure does not absorb anything, it transmits. Every joint locked from the floor to the sternum turns a man into one solid object, and a solid object cannot dissipate force, it can only take all of it and then go. The champion had made himself into a wall, and a wall is exactly the easiest thing in the world to move, if what you are sending into it is not a punch but a shock. The small man in black stepped in. He set the knuckles of his right hand against the champion's chest, an inch out, close enough that the two of them could hear each other breathe. His shoulders did not lift, his elbow did not draw back. There was nowhere for it to go. He was not, by any definition the crowd would have recognized, in a position to hit anybody. And then almost nothing happened, and the whole building came apart. What the people close to the floor saw was this. The small man's rear heel turned, maybe a quarter of an inch. His hip rotated. Something traveled up his back, visible for a fraction of a second through the black fabric, and his fist did not so much travel as arrive. There was no wind up to watch at all. The sound was not what anyone expected. It was not a slap, and it was not the flat thud of a punching bag. It was deeper and shorter than either, a single compressed report, like a heavy door slamming somewhere in a concrete stairwell, and 3,000 people heard it in a hall built for boat shows. And the champion went. His feet did not slide, they left. His braced legs, locked so hard into the floor, came off it entirely. The locked structure he had made of himself took every ounce of the force and had nowhere to put it. He went backward off his heels with his arms coming up and his eyes very wide, and he covered the floor behind him in a way that nobody afterward could agree on. He hit the folding chairs at the edge of the demonstration area and took two of them with him, and the metal went across the concrete with a screech that finished the sentence the punch had started, and then he was down among the chairs with one arm out and the wind entirely gone out of him. There was a beat of total silence. Then 3,000 people made a noise that older men in that room would describe for the rest of their lives as unlike any tournament noise they had ever heard. Not a cheer, because it was not a victory, but the sound a crowd makes when the floor has shifted under something they were sure of. And the small man in black did not stand there and enjoy it. He was moving before the chairs had finished settling. He crossed the floor fast, and he went down on one knee beside the champion, and he put a hand flat on his upper back and told him, the men closest heard it clearly, not to try to breathe yet. Just wait, it will come back on its own. Do not fight for it. Because that is the other thing about a strike into the sternum. It does not injure, it interrupts. The diaphragm seizes, and for 20 or 30 seconds a grown man cannot pull air, and every instinct he has tells him to panic, and panicking makes it last longer. The small man knelt there with his hand on the champion's back and talked him through it, quietly, the way you talk to someone who has had the wind knocked out of them, while 3,000 people watched, and a tournament official ran over with a first aid box that nobody needed. The champion's breath came back. He sat up among the folding chairs, and what he did then is the reason anyone still tells this story. He started to laugh. Not a small laugh, a real one, wheezing and enormous and slightly wrecked, and he put a hand on the small man's shoulder to steady himself and laughed until he had to stop and get his air again. Then he got to his feet, waving off two people who tried to help him, walked to the announcer's table and held out his hand for the microphone, and the announcer gave it to him because nobody was going to say no to that man in that moment. He stood in the middle of the floor with his chin askew and his breathing still not right, and he said to 3,000 people and 80 black belts along the wall, "I want everybody here to know that I asked for that." They laughed. He waited. Then he said, "And I want everybody here to know that I told him I'd been hit by heavyweights." And he looked over at the small man in black and he said, into the microphone, that he had been telling the truth about that, and that it did not matter, because he had never in his life been hit by anything like that, and that whatever it was he had just felt, it was not a bigger version of what he already knew, it was a different thing entirely. And then he said the sentence that got repeated in dojos for the next 30 years. He said, "I braced." He told me to relax, and I braced, because I thought I was being smart. And then he tapped his own chest. The same 2 fingers, the same spot, and he said, "That's on me. Learn from it." The 80 black belts along the wall were not folding their arms anymore. The tournament went on. It always does. The next division was called. The floor was cleared, the chairs were set back up, and by the evening finals most of the crowd had folded the whole thing into an anecdote. But there were maybe 200 people close enough to hear the sound and to watch a man in black go to one knee beside the person he had just flattened and tell him how to breathe, and those 200 did not fold it into anything. They carried it. The champion sought him out afterward, in the corridor behind the bleachers where the competitors were packing up gear. He asked, without any performance in it now, whether the small man would teach him that. And the small man said it would take about 3 years, and that he did not have 3 years, but that he would show him the first part tonight if he wanted. And the 2 of them sat on a pile of mats in a corridor that smelled like liniment, while everybody else went to dinner. Years later, when the champion had become a film star in his own right, an interviewer asked him about the toughest hit he had ever taken. He named a couple of the heavyweights, out of respect, and then he said that none of those were the answer, and he told the story of the tournament, and he was still laughing about it, decades on. The interviewer asked whether he had been embarrassed, and he said no. He said, "I got hit in the chest in front of 3,000 people, and I got up, and I got the microphone, and I told them all I was wrong." He said, "You know how many men get a chance to be that publicly wrong about something that mattered?" He said it was the best afternoon of his career. Years later, the people who were in that hall would argue about the details, the way they always do, how far he traveled, whether it was 2 chairs or 3, whether the sound was really that loud. But every one of them told the same 2 things the same way. The first was the sound, and the second was that the man who threw the punch was on his knees beside him before the chairs stopped moving, telling him not to fight for the breath, because it was coming back.